Thank you all for inviting me to be here tonight, and I got to catch the beginning of VBS. My wife, as Jay mentioned, is a children's minister at our church, and this is our VBS week. And ours at Brentwood Oaks is during the daytime, Monday through Thursday, and so she's pulling her hair out. She would have been here with me tonight, but she's quite busy, tied up on the theme for us, not Scooby-Doo. The theme for us this year is road trip, and they're in an RV, and they're crossing the desert with Moses and learning that God is with you everywhere you go. So it's kind of fun to see how creative that can be. So I understand Jay told me that you guys have been focusing on the Ten Commandments as well as your kids this week, particularly in the context of marriage, but as we got to talking about what I could share and thinking about what I do for a living, and I thought I would just kind of share some thoughts and perspectives in a more broader sense on God and the law, and from my perspective, and hopefully for your edification, the courts. It's my hope that what I share will remind you of some things and perhaps be helpful as you think about some of the challenges that we face as Christians who are in this world but not of this world. There's some very substantial obstacles that make it tough for me to talk about some of these things tonight, and one is that there are libraries full of books on God and the law and the court's role in dealing with those. And I've only got a few minutes, and so I can't say everything that I would even want to say about the topic tonight. Another challenge is pretty much convinced that everybody already knows what you think about God and our laws and how the relationship ought to be. And I'm pretty sure most of us are pretty confident that our view is the right one. And so if I say anything that challenges your view tonight, I just ask that you give it some prayerful thought and appreciate that we're all searching for, if not the truth, thank God for the truth that we have in His Word, but for wisdom on how that truth applies to those of us experiencing the worlds in which we live. Third, I have to be careful what I say about topics when we talk about the law, because many of these issues, or at least themes related to some of these issues that we might talk about tonight, are likely to come before the court I sit on. And one of the laws that governs me as a judge is called the Code of Judicial Conduct. And the Code of Judicial Conduct prohibits me from speaking publicly in any way that might indicate how I might rule in a case that would come before my court. And if I were to publicly indicate how I might rule, then if and when an important case comes to the court, I would have to recuse myself and would not be allowed to participate. So I'm always careful to not be too opinionated when I speak in public like this. And that, by the way, is why I'm trying to follow some notes here when I normally would be a bit more conversational. But I do want to share some thoughts with you, but be careful how I do that. So what I want to do this evening is share a few words about three fairly general issues. First, how does God view our laws? Second, how do our laws view God? And third, what are the court's role in dealing with those relationships? So I suspect most of us Christians, when we think about God's view of law, we think of the Ten Commandments and the other commandments and regulations described in Leviticus and the various commandments that appear in the New Testament. Some of us will also think about how Paul taught about righteousness of God is apart from the law, and that we're under grace, not under the law. And yet we also know that faith by itself is dead and not accompanied by works. All these truths that we think about when we think as Christians about law and God, they address God's law and what we know as salvation. And I want to focus on something different tonight. I'm not talking about God's law and foundation and salvation in the sense of grace and obedience, but rather I want to focus more on how God views our laws when we come together as a culture and a society to decide how to regulate ourselves. I won't spend much time on this first issue, but I think it's worth a short summary as a foundation for what I may share about the second and third issues. So one thing we know about God's view of human laws is that He detests unjust laws. Woe to you, Pharisees, Jesus said, because you promote your own laws, but you neglect justice and mercy and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. And Jesus said, you lawyers, woe to you also, because your laws load people down with burdens that they can hardly carry, and you yourselves will not even lift a finger to help them. Any lawyers besides Kim? And Kim's in a classroom. Am I the only lawyer in the room right now? So I'll just say, ouch. I think we can be confident that God wants human laws to be fair and to promote justice and mercy and be equal for everyone. A second thing we know about how God views our laws is that He knows they can be easily used as a means to create division and strife and promote selfishness and greed. I was a litigator, meaning a courtroom lawyer, before I became a judge. And for most all of my career I did that. But one of my favorite verses about the law has been 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 7. So in the first 6 verses of 1 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul really harshly rebukes the Christians in Corinth because they were suing each other in the civil courts over what he calls trivial cases. And so he chastises them for not working out their disputes among themselves. And then in verse 7 he says, instead of suing someone who does you wrong, why not just rather be wronged? Why not rather be cheated? Now, I know Paul was talking specifically about suits between fellow Christians, and as a litigator, I love a good courtroom battle as much as the next guy. But I can tell you firsthand what a toll it takes on all parties to a case. Their reputations, their property, their time, their relationships are all at stake. I used to tell potential clients, you may win this case, but you're still going to lose in the end. I can't count how many times I've asked people who've come to me for legal advice, both Christians and non-Christians, okay, it sure sounds like he wronged you, but why not rather be wronged than to take the route that you're pursuing? Now that's certainly not a very popular view in our culture, which tells us more and more to demand justice and to fight for our rights. And I'm not saying that Christians should never file a lawsuit or demand justice, but I think it's true at least that God urges us as Christians to be peacemakers who minimize strife and show true love to our enemies as well as to our neighbors. Well, a final thing we know about how God views man's laws, and this is particularly important as we think about the next two issues, is that He knows that our laws are ultimately subject to His and to His authority. The Bible teaches us that all dominion belongs to God, and God alone rules over the nations, and He's the one who makes nations great, and He destroys them. And He removes kings, and He raises new kings to take their place. In short, He's got the whole world in His hands. And that includes us and our nation and our laws. Well, that brings me to the second issue I want to discuss then is, well, how do our nation and our laws view God? Respectfully, it looks to me like most of you are old enough to be thinking right now that the answer to that question is different today than it used to be. And I think it's true that to talk about our nation's laws and how they view God, we have to kind of tell a story that has a beginning and numerous chapters along the way, and I think an ending that's not yet been written. I know there's some dispute out there, but it's historically undeniable that our nation and its laws were founded on and heavily influenced by our founders' views of God, specifically the God of the Bible. That's not to say that every founder of this country believed in the God of the Bible or even in any God at all, but the public and shared ceremonial discourse, at least, very openly and intentionally expressed that our nation and its laws were established on a generally accepted corporate view of God and our dependence on Him. The Declaration of Independence, for example, begins by explaining the reasons that our founders decided to leave England and claim the separate and equal station which nature's God entitled them. And the very first reason was that they held these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And in the Declaration's conclusion, the founders appealed to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions and expressed their firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. Indeed, Thomas Jefferson, who drafted the Declaration and is considered by many to be among the least religious of our founding fathers, wrote at one point of his fear that Americans would face God's wrath for forgetting that their liberties are the gift of God. 11 years after the Declaration, the states convened and approved the Constitution on, quote, the 17th day of September in the year of our Lord, 1787. That's the only religious reference we find in the Constitution, of course, until we get to the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment. But lest we think that the founders were not concerned with God's provisions for what they were doing, all we have to do is look at President Washington's first inauguration 2 years later. And he said he would be remiss if he didn't offer fervent supplications to that almighty being who rules over the universe, who presides in the council of nations, and whose providential aids can supply every human defect. And he observed that no people are more obligated to acknowledge God's invisible providing hand than the people of the United States. And just a few weeks after that, our first president issued the Thanksgiving Proclamation. Whereas, he said, it's the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of the Almighty God and to obey His will, to be grateful for His benefits, and humbly to implore His protection and favor. Washington declared November 26 of that year to be devoted by the people of these states to the service of that great and glorious being who is the beneficent author of all the good that was, that is, or that will be. And set it aside as a day to beseech God to pardon our national and other transgressions and to promote the knowledge and practice of true religion and virtue. Well, if we get concerned that maybe Washington was a lone religious zealot, we should realize that it was Congress who passed a bill ordering Washington to declare a national day of Thanksgiving. And that same year, 1789, Congress passed the first Judiciary Act and required that everybody who becomes a federal judge take an oath to fulfill their duties, quote, so help me God. Like Washington, Presidents Jefferson and Madison each prayed for God's guidance and favor and blessings at their inaugurations. And since the very beginning, congressional sessions are opened every day with a prayer. The Supreme Court opens, "Oyez, oyez, oyez, God save this honorable court." My court does the same thing each day that we gather for oral arguments. These kinds of public recognitions of God's providence within our laws and the benefits of our nation continued for many decades. In 1798, John Adams, in a speech to the Massachusetts militia, said, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate. Our Constitution is wholly inadequate for the government of anyone but a moral and religious people." And in 1865, President Lincoln, in his second inaugural address, given in the midst of our country's darkest hour, observed that the Almighty has His own purposes. And he famously concluded, "With malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we're in." I don't have time to recite every example, but keep in mind that most of this all occurred even though after the Bill of Rights in 1789, ratified finally in 1791, provided that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, what we know of as the religion clause of the First Amendment. Now, it's important to recognize that this religion clause of the First Amendment actually includes two separate clauses. What's called the Establishment Clause, which prohibits Congress from establishing religion, and the Free Exercise Clause, which prohibits Congress from interfering with the people's exercise of their religion. As you know, this short 16-word provision has been the subject of much difficult debate, particularly within the United States Supreme Court through the years. So what has that court had to say about God and religion and laws? Again, discussing this requires kind of telling a story with many chapters, but let me just highlight a few. In 1892, in a case involving the Church of the Holy Trinity in New York, the court addressed a federal statute that prohibited anyone from hiring an immigrant from another country to come in and work in the United States. So immigration has been an issue for a long time in this country. So they passed a law that made it illegal to hire someone to come to the United States to work. And the key question in this Church of the Holy Trinity case was whether the church violated that statute by hiring their new pastor from England. The court held it did not violate the law, concluding that it could not construe any federal statute to act, quote, against religion, because all of American history demonstrates that, quote, this is a religious people. The court went on to describe a litany of examples of why it believed that America is made up of a religious people. The commission to Christopher Columbus was issued by the grace of God, it said. The first colonial grant by Queen Elizabeth was given, quote, by the grace of God, and so on and so on. And after discussing all these examples, the court concluded there is a universal language pervading all of these commissions and grants on which our country was founded, having one meaning. They affirm and reaffirm that this is a religious nation. The court even quoted from a decision from a New York Supreme Court asserting, we are a Christian people, and the morality of the country is deeply engrafted upon Christianity. That was our United States Supreme Court in 1892. A second example is a very interesting case from 1931 called United States versus McIntosh. Now, McIntosh was an immigrant from Canada, and he was denied citizenship because he refused to take the part of the citizenship oath where he had to agree to defend the country. He said he would only defend the country if he believed that the particular war that he was called to was morally justified, because he would always put his allegiance, quote, to the will of God before his allegiance to the United States. The court held that the government properly denied him his citizenship because his explanation indicated that he would put, quote, his own interpretation of the will of God over his allegiance to the country. An interesting decision, but holding that a citizen of the United States cannot do this, the court explained, we are a Christian people, according to one another the equal right of religious freedom, and acknowledging with reverence the duty of obedience to the will of God. But also we are a nation with the duty to survive, and because we're a Christian people, we can safely assume that unqualified allegiance to the nation and submission and obedience to the laws of the land are not inconsistent with the will of God. Interesting analysis, all based on the idea that this is a Christian nation full of Christian people. Well, these kinds of statements in Supreme Court opinions probably sound a bit quaint, if not completely outdated and wrong to us in 2019. This is a religious nation. We are a Christian people. What about the separation of church and state? Well, that phrase first arrives in a Supreme Court opinion in 1947. in a case called Everson versus Board of Education. And the issue there was whether a school district could use their tax dollars to pay to bus their children to school, including a local private religious parochial school. So they were using their tax dollars to provide busing to all of the students going to whatever school they went to. One of them happened to be a private religious school, and some folks sued saying you can't do that. This was the first case in which the Supreme Court held that the First Amendment religion clause, which says that Congress shall make no laws establishing religion, also governs the state legislatures. And so the court, writing for the court, the Chief Justice, or Justice Hugo Black, wrote that this religion clause prohibiting the establishment of religion has, quote, erected a wall between church and state, which prohibits the government, both state and federal, not only from showing a preference for one religion over another, but also adopting laws that, quote, aid all religions. The court concluded, however, that the First Amendment did not prohibit the tax-funded busing of children to private Christian schools because the rest of the religion clause, the free exercise clause, says that Congress can't make a law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. Again, that was 1947. Under the free exercise clause, the court held, the government cannot exclude individual Catholics, Lutherans, Mohammedans, Baptist Jews, Methodists, non-believers, Presbyterians, or the members of any other faith because of their faith or lack of it from receiving the benefits of public welfare legislation. Well, this decision, the Everson decision, both illustrates and sort of foretells how complicated the relationship between the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause would become in the Supreme Court's decisions. But in truth, that complexity was not a new development. The phrase in Everson referring to the wall between church and state is not in the Constitution at all, but instead was first used in a private letter written by Thomas Jefferson way back in 1802. It was the same Jefferson who wrote so openly about the Creator and the Supreme Judge in the Declaration of Independence. And what happened was that a group had written to him, a group called the Danbury Baptist Association, when he was about to become president, and expressed their concern that he was not going to let them freely exercise their religion. Well, as I mentioned earlier, many consider Jefferson to be among the least religious of our founding fathers, but he replied by letter to assure them that he believed that, quote, religion is a matter which lies solely between a man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, and that the legitimate powers of government reach only actions and not religious opinions. And then he quoted the First Amendment, which he said characterized as building a wall of separation between church and state, and assured them that that wall would protect them from government interference with their religious practice. So when Jefferson referred to the wall of separation between church and state, he was talking about the wall that protects the citizens' right to freely exercise their faith, not a wall that prohibits the government from establishing religion. But in any event, despite the public and ceremonial discourse, even as early as 1882, the tension was there. And the court first began to directly address it in 1947 in that Everson case. Well, since then, and particularly since 1961, which happens to be the year I was born, we've had a whirlwind of Supreme Court decisions that struggle to apply the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause to particular circumstances. Where they've ended up so far is essentially this: the government can pass laws and do other things that may appear to support religion, or at least religion in general, but only if those laws or other actions have a generally secular or historical purpose. So in 1961, the court upheld the Sunday Blue laws that required stores to be closed on Sundays, even though the laws referred to Sundays as the Sabbath day and the Lord's day. 1962, the court struck down prayer in public schools because that practice had, in the court's view, only a religious purpose. In 1963, they struck down Bible reading in public schools essentially for the same reason. And in 71, the court held that the Establishment Clause prohibits states from using public funds to support private religious schools. In 1985, the court struck down a law requiring schools to have a moment of silence, quote, for meditation or voluntary prayer, again, because it found there to be no reason other than a religious reason. And in 1992, in Levy-Wiseman, the court struck down non-sectarian prayers at public school graduation ceremonies. More recently, the court has issued a couple of decisions that permit some connection between government and religion, but only because it found some primary secular or historical purpose. So, for example, in 2005, does that look familiar, Jay? In 2005, the court held that Texas could keep our Ten Commandments monument on the Capitol grounds in Austin because it merely symbolizes and memorializes what the court called, quote, the role of religion in American life. So it didn't promote religion, the court held, it just memorialized the role of religion in American life. That monument still sits just outside my window at the court building on the Capitol grounds, and I actually was Deputy Attorney General for John Cornyn when this suit was filed, and I was involved in it from the very beginning, and I would tell you interesting stories about it if I had more time. If we have time for questions, maybe you can ask one about that. But it's a fascinating story, not only because it's one of the rare cases in which the United States Supreme Court allowed something like this, but because on that exact same day, the court issued a separate opinion in a different case that said that 2 Kentucky counties had to remove copies of the Ten Commandments that they had posted in their county courthouses because the purpose of those postings was merely to emphasize and celebrate a religious message. There was no secular or historical purpose. But then just this year, in February of this year, the court allowed a 40-foot tall Latin cross known as the Peace Cross to remain on public property in Maryland, essentially because it had a long-standing historical purpose of memorializing the deaths of 42 local soldiers in World War I, rather than expressing a Christian or religious message. So where does this all leave us? The simple answer is no one quite knows. These cases are almost always 5-4 decisions, if not 5-2 to 1-1, and multiple writings with all different reasoning. I went to law school learning what's called the Lemon Test. You saw Lemon versus Kurtzman up there was one of them, and that's where the court tried to lay out, okay, here's how we apply, here's the test to apply. And now most of the writings are saying a Lemon Test doesn't work, we've got to find something different. So we don't know really quite where we are in terms of how the court construes the First Amendment religion clauses. We don't even know where it will lead us because of that. There are many ways to answer those questions, but the truth is we really don't know. And the reason we don't know has a lot to do with the fact that our current president has recently appointed 2 new justices to the United States Supreme Court. And he could end up appointing 1 or 2 more, and maybe even more than that if he's reelected next year. For him and for his political opponents alike, the right to appoint federal judges, and especially Supreme Court justices, has become the crucial political battleground between the 2 sides. Now, I'm not in any way implying that we should or should not re-elect our current president. Don't hear me addressing that at all. But because the emphasis that both sides put on the importance of having the right to appoint judges and justices leads me to the last issue I want to talk about briefly, and that is, what is the court's role in addressing the relationship between God and our laws? Well, this is the point in which I have to say things that may be more challenging to you than most, but I hope you'll thoughtfully hear me out. Under our Constitution, the court's role is to interpret the Constitution and statutes and then apply them to particular cases that come before them. The effect, of course, is that courts announce the results and outcomes that the people either like or don't like. Every case you decide, half the parties hate you and the other half like you. Out there among people who are not even parties, if it's a case that's important, like some of the ones I've talked about this evening, half people like you and half the people hate you. But they do it because, well, the Latin cross gets to stay, or the Ten Commandments monument gets to stay, or prayer has to go, and so on. And naturally, citizens tend to judge their judges by the outcomes of the cases rather than by the underlying law or the judge's analysis and interpreting that law. Now, we should definitely judge our judges, but should we judge them based on the outcome of a case that they decide? Is it a judge's role to reach a particular outcome? I think many people believe it is. Since I've been on the Texas Supreme Court, we've heard or agreed to hear or decided not to hear numerous cases that involve the tension between law and religion. For example, a few that we dealt with over the last several years related to the same-sex marriage issue. Now, most of those were before the United States Supreme Court's decision in a case called Obergefell that came out in 2015, in which the United States Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution requires all states to recognize and allow such marriages. So before that decision came down, for example, in one particular case, a lower court had allowed a same-sex couple who had married in a different state that allowed such marriages to get a divorce in Texas. And the Attorney General argued that Texas law would not allow that. Now, it's not worth going into much detail here, but we declined to rule on that issue because of procedural, pretty mundane but very important jurisdictional issue about the Attorney General's role in that. And so we didn't address the question itself. Now, it's rare and frankly under our rules inappropriate for citizens to write or email us judges about a case, but it's not hard to find our email addresses. And in those cases, we received plenty of emails. I will intentionally not go into the details of the cases beyond what I've said, but here are a few examples of the emails we received. A man from Midland, subject line, shame. I am expressing my disappointment at the way you dodged your godly responsibility to protect the standards and moral practices that govern our society. From a man from Tyler. You justices do not have the intestinal fortitude to stand up for the values that the majority of Texans uphold. You should have addressed the question, you are nothing in my sight except that of an embarrassment. From Native Texan with the subject line, shame on you, shame on each of you for your anti-family and unbiblical decision. From a man named Darrell, I will vote only for those who will uphold God's law, and our civil law is in direct conflict with that. But then here are a few more emails we received. A woman who identified herself as a lifelong conservative and past chair of her local Republican Party. This is simply a note to say I approve of your refusing to hear the case concerning denial of rights to same-sex spouses. You are all doing an excellent job. Another gentleman, thank you for staying with our founding fathers and keeping church and state separate and maintaining equality in Texas for all Texans. As a Republican, you all make me proud today. From a Republican woman in Corpus Christi, please keep the friendly state of Texas a part of our free country and be pro-same-sex marriage. Now, all those emails were in response to the same case in which we decided that we couldn't address the issue. Well, a few years ago, we heard a case that did raise the issue in kind of a unique situation, which was whether the Constitution requires states to provide equal benefits to the spouses of same-sex couples when one of them is an employee of the government. So not just whether you have to recognize the marriage as being a marriage, but do you have to provide public benefits to spouses in such marriages? After the case was filed and decided in the lower courts, but before it came to us, the United States Supreme Court issued the decision in 2015 in Obergefell saying that all states have to recognize same-sex marriages. Well, I wrote the court's opinion in that case, and we unanimously decided not to decide that issue about whether the Constitution required the state to provide public benefits on an equal basis, but instead send the case back to the lower court so that the parties could argue the issue for the first time in light of Obergefell, which had just come out. Now, as you might imagine, the progressives were mad that we didn't say the Constitution does require it, and the conservatives were mad that we didn't say it does not require it. Yet the law had just changed because of Obergefell, and neither of the parties had ever yet had a chance to argue it either way. Well, I mention all this to highlight the question, what is a judge's role in deciding these types of cases under our system? And on a more personal level, what is a Christian judge's role? Is it a judge's role to, quote, protect the standards and moral practices that govern our society, to stand up for the values that the majority of Texans uphold, to promote marriage between any two loving persons, or to legalize particular relationships in Texas? Well, if you go to my website, which Jay helps me with from time to time, you'll see I've said it from the very beginning when I got appointed to the court. Justice Boyd is a judicial conservative who understands that the role of the judiciary is to interpret and apply the law and not to, anyone know? Create it or write it. That's right. You hear it all the time. And I believe that. And I say that all the time. And whenever I say it in a group of political conservatives, all the heads in the room nod and I see a room full of smiles. Yes, judges aren't supposed to create the law. They're supposed to interpret and apply it. But do we really believe that a judge's role is to interpret it and not to make it? And if so, then how can we criticize judges for the outcomes of the cases in which they apply laws that other people have written? How can we criticize them for not upholding God's law or urge them to legalize particular actions and relationships? Based on my fairly thorough study of the Constitution, I think I would violate my oath if I decided a case based on what I want the outcome to be when that's not what the law requires or allows. Now, I was very fortunate that part of my early study of the Constitution in law school was an intensive 3-week course in a class of only 12 students at Pepperdine on the constitutional separation of powers, taught by none other than the late Antonin Scalia. 12 students, 3 weeks, just with him on the separation of powers. And he too firmly believed that results-oriented judges aren't judging, they're legislating. And yet our Constitution reserves, quote, all legislative powers to Congress, not to judges. Well, as recent events demonstrate, we conservatives are quick to agree with this constitutional principle, but we're just as quick to criticize and mistrust a judge when we don't like the results of their decision. Now, I'm not saying this to protect judges. I'm saying it to protect our constitutional form of government. I fear that the recent divisions within our country over very important policy issues and the manner in which those issues are presented both by the conventional media and through social media and through our legislators and through many of our judges has brought us to the point where most of us have given up on the idea of this constitutional separation of powers, and we see judges as just another type of political player in a political system. Part of that, though, is the fault of judges. The truth is, we do have our own personal views from affecting how we interpret and apply the laws that come before us. Back in the early 1900s, one of the U.S. Supreme Court judges said, "We judges may try to see things as objectively as we please. Nonetheless, we can never see them with any eyes except our own." And that's true. But if we don't constantly check ourselves on every case we decide to ensure that our decisions are based on the law that governs the case instead of on our own personal views, then we definitely share the blame for politicizing the judiciary and for undermining the constitutional structure on which our nation is based. But, and now I'm to my final point, if it's true that the role of a judge is not to write the law, but to simply interpret and apply it as written, regardless of the outcome, then what's the role of a Christian judge? As Justice Scalia famously said, if you're going to be a good and faithful judge in our system, you have to resign yourself to the fact that you're not always going to like the conclusions you reach. But what if the result is not just something I don't like, but something I believe violates God's law? Well, this is the great dilemma for me as a judge, for all judges, but not just for judges and not just for Christian judges. It's a great dilemma for Christian lawyers, Christian teachers, Christian bankers, Christian florists, Christian insurance agents, and so on and so on. Can a Christian Uber driver drive a customer who wants to get dropped off at a bar or at some place even seedier? Ultimately, it's the same issue for all of us. Christians, for whom I have great respect, have taken very different approaches to this question. Some conclude that there are just some jobs, especially in government service, that a Christian cannot have. I'm an Air Force brat. I grew up living on military base after military base. My dad was in Vietnam, and I can remember my mother had a bumper sticker the year my dad was in Vietnam on the back of the car. And on one side it had an American flag, on the other a cross, and in the middle it said, "Why not both?" And I asked her, what does that mean? I was third grade. What does that mean? Well, there are some people that don't think Christians can be in the military. Well, there are very honest people who have great faith in God and in Christ who hold that view. Others disagree. Some have very different views on how to approach the job. So you can have your job as an Uber driver, but what do you do when the situations come up? One very well-known Christian judge was removed from the bench because he took the position that as a Christian, he could not obey a federal court order that required him to remove the Ten Commandments from his courthouse. So he was in a state court. They had a Ten Commandments monument. It went through the federal court system, and the final judgment said, no, this violates the Constitution. You must remove it. And he said, as a Christian, I can't do that. As a Christian judge responsible for this courthouse, I can't do that. In his view, the federal court's decision was wrong because it misunderstood the Establishment Clause. And to obey the order of the court would be to obey an order that he thought was unlawful under the Establishment Clause. In his view, he said, and he wrote this, quote, "The rule of law in this country is the United States Constitution, not the courts. This means that if the Constitution says one thing and a federal court says something else, then a federal or state official who's sworn to support the Constitution must follow the Constitution and ignore the court order." Well, contrast him with the judge for whom I worked when I first got out of law school. A guy named Tom Reevely, who was born in Quitman, Texas, and served ultimately as Texas Supreme Court Justice, Texas Secretary of State, and now at the age of 98 is still a senior judge on the Federal Court of Appeals, active as a judge in the Federal Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. He served most of his life as a lawyer and judge, but also as a Methodist lay minister. And he became so well known and respected for his Christian faith that folks call him the Pope of the Fifth Circuit. In an article he published in the 90s called My Faith and My Work, he addressed this issue by suggesting that he personally thought the death penalty was wrong, or at least wrongfully applied in most cases. But he would nevertheless, as a judge, enter an order of execution if that's what the law required. And so he wrote, "Some may ask whether my faith interferes with my judicial application of the First Amendment guarantees of free exercise and against the establishment of religion. As I understand those guarantees and my judicial responsibility, I see no problem. Not only can I follow the law that allows every individual the freedom to believe and worship as she chooses, I strongly approve of that law. It's a law indispensable to a society of such diversity as ours. From the beginning of this nation and through the centuries since, most of the draftsmen and enforcers of the law have believed in it, even though they personally were Christian. We must allow the free exercise of those with whom we disagree. Well, you can probably surmise that I tend to lean more to Judge Reevely's resolution of this dilemma, though I don't fully agree with either of them. Because these are not easy questions with easy answers for Christian judges or for Christian Uber drivers. Fortunately, judges have the option, even the obligation, to not participate in a case if we think our own beliefs and personal commitments would keep us from fairly applying the law that governs the case. Fortunately, I've not yet had to do that in any case that came before me, even though I can say that I have not personally agreed with or liked every law that I've had to apply and enforce. And of course, there may come a point at which I could have to simply decide that I can no longer serve as a judge at all. But in that sense, I think I'm no different than any of you. Each of us, no matter our profession, can be, and perhaps even should be, faced with situations that challenge how we live out our faith. Maybe you've heard of Jaylene Hinkle. She's considered to be one of the top women soccer players, a defender in the country. And as a little girl growing up and attending a Christian school in Colorado, she always dreamed of getting the chance to play internationally for the U.S. women's team. But when she finally got that invitation 2 years ago, she was told that the team, when she played with them in Brazil, would be wearing rainbow-themed jerseys in honor of LGBTQ Pride Month. With her dream finally having come true, she turned down the invitation, explaining that her faith would not let her participate if she had to wear that jersey. As you can imagine, she's been heavily criticized by all kinds of people and in the press and social media, and is now even booed by spectators at games that she's playing at since then. After dedicating herself to the game of soccer, enjoying so much success, and finally getting the opportunity to play internationally for her country, can you imagine how difficult her decision must have been? Well, we all face these kinds of issues, maybe not quite at the same level as her. As I said, because at the beginning, we are in the world and yet not of the world. God gave His people the 10 Commandments for a reason, but we've never quite been able to keep them. And more it seems, we're happy to find ways to replace them with laws that are as imperfect and unholy as we ourselves become when we leave God behind. So what are we to do? Let me close with just a few thoughts on how I try to approach these kinds of questions. First, I firmly believe that as the Bible teaches, blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. And because I want our nation to be blessed, I want to step up when opportunities arise to encourage people around me to think about who God is and how they in their own lives and we corporately as a society can best honor Him. That's kind of why I decided to speak on this topic with you tonight. Second, I believe, as I quoted earlier, that God is in control of this nation. And He is in control of all nations on this earth. And so I try to focus on being part of His plan instead of expecting Him to become a part of mine. Third, as I read the New Testament, Paul never instructed his readers on how to be a good Corinthian or a good Roman or a good Galatian or Ephesian. So I'm not too worried about how to be a good American. Instead, he instructed them on how to be a good, faithful Christian who happens to live in Corinth or Rome or Ephesus. So I try to focus more on just being salt and light instead of vinegar and fire. In the end, I'd rather motivate people to have faith in Jesus Christ than convince them to have faith in Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. fourth, as much as I want to dispense true justice when I'm on the bench, I hope I'm granting mercy when my robe is off. I, for one, am glad that Jesus is as much about mercy as he is about justice. We all want to fight for justice, but justice has two sharp edges. After all, Jesus is the one who said that all the law and all the prophets hang on just two commandments: love God and love your neighbor. And finally, I find guidance from these instructions, which I've compiled from Romans and 1 Peter and Titus and Timothy, and put them together as a guidance that I try to follow. Subject yourselves to governing authorities, for we know there is no authority God has not established. Honor them. Be submissive to your rulers and authorities. Be obedient, ready for every good work, speaking evil of no one, avoiding quarrels, showing courtesy to all, and living peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. For we know that this is good and pleases God. So thank you again for letting me come this evening, and I just pray that God would grant us all the wisdom to know how to please him as we live as imperfect beings in this imperfect world, and the courage to do it. Thank you, and God bless you.